Hey, everybody. Welcome back to One More Thing. Doing something a little different today. Today, the House Democrats, they released their draft report on the Trump-Ukraine impeachment inquiry report. And in it, they level what they believe will be the accusations and kind of a preliminary judgment about what the articles of impeachment that will likely be voted on in the House, sending it to the Senate for a trial. Now, I know that not everybody has the time to wade through some of this. This is over 300 pages, or just right around 300 pages. And what I want to do is read the preface, the executive summary. There's two sections of the executive summary, section 1 and section 2. And so I'm going to read them. I'm going to sit here and read as much as I can, and hopefully that serves as some sort of a benefit to those of you who don't have the time or the interest to burn through the energy of actually going through. So, a little different. This is where I record my podcast, I Doubt It with Dollemore. So what I'm going to do is just sit here with the podcast mic, not a lav mic. Some of the technical details probably don't matter at all. But nonetheless, let's get into this. Starting from page 7, if you would like to follow along. The preface. This report reflects the evidence gathered thus far by the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, in coordination with the Committee on Oversight and Reform and the Committee on Foreign Affairs, as part of the House of Representatives' impeachment inquiry into Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States. The report is the culmination of an investigation that began in September 2019 and intensified over the past 3 months as new revelations and evidence of the president's misconduct toward Ukraine emerged. The committees pursued the truth vigorously but fairly, ensuring the full participation of both parties throughout the probe. Sustained by the tireless work of more than 36 dedicated staff across the 3 committees, we issued dozens of subpoenas for documents and testimony and took more than 100 hours of deposition testimony from 17 witnesses. To provide the American people the opportunity to learn and evaluate the facts themselves, the Intelligence Committee held 7 public hearings with 12 witnesses, including 3 requested by the Republican minority. That totaled more than 30 hours. At the outset, I wanted to recognize my late friend and colleague, Elijah E. Cummings, whose grace and commitment to justice served as our North Star throughout this investigation. I would also like to thank my colleagues Elliot L. Engel and Carolyn B. Maloney, chairs respectively of the Foreign Affairs and Oversight and Reform Committees, as well as the members of those committees, many of whom provided invaluable contributions. Members of the Intelligence Committee as well worked selflessly and collaboratively throughout this investigation. Finally, I am grateful to Speaker Nancy Pelosi for the trust she placed in our committees to conduct this work and for her wise counsel throughout. I also want to thank the dedicated professional staff of the Intelligence Committee who worked ceaselessly and with remarkable poise and ability. My deepest gratitude goes to, and then he names several people. In addition, Intelligence Committee staff members also assured that the important oversight work of the committee continued, even as we were required to take on the additional responsibility of conducting a key part of the House impeachment inquiry. Finally, I would like to thank the devoted and outstanding staff of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, including but not limited to, and he lists some names. In his farewell address, President George Washington warned of a moment when, quote, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be able to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which had lifted them to unjust dominion. Page 8. The framers of the Constitution well understood that an individual could one day occupy the office of the president who would place his personal or political interests above those of the nation. Having just won hard-fought independence from a king with unbridled authority, they were attuned to the dangers of an executive who lacked fealty to the law and the Constitution. In response, the framers adopted a tool used by the British Parliament for several hundred years to constrain the crown, the power of impeachment. Unlike in Britain, where impeachment was typically reserved for inferior officers, but not for the king himself, impeachment in our untested democracy was specifically intended to serve as the ultimate form of accountability for a duly elected president. Rather than a mechanism to overturn an election, impeachment was explicitly contemplated as a remedy of last resort for a president who fails to faithfully execute his oath of office, quote, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Accordingly, the Constitution confers the power to impeach the president on Congress, stating that the president shall be removed from office upon conviction for, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. While the constitutional standard for removal from office is justly a high one, it is nonetheless an essential check and balance on the authority of the occupant of the office of the president, particularly when that office represents a continuing threat to our fundamental democratic norms, values, and laws. Alexander Hamilton explained that impeachment was not designed to cover only criminal violations, but also crimes against the American people, quote, the subjects of its jurisdiction. Hamilton wrote, quote, are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself, unquote. I'm glad we don't write and talk like that anymore. Back to the document, page 8. Similarly, future Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court James Wilson, a delegate from Pennsylvania at the Constitutional Convention, distinguished impeachable offenses from those that reside, quote, within the sphere of ordinary jurisprudence, unquote. As he noted, impeachments are confined to political characters, to political crimes and misdemeanors, and not to political punishments. As this report details, the impeachment inquiry has found that President Trump, personally and acting through agents within and outside of the U.S. government, solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, to benefit his reelection. In furtherance of this scheme, President Trump conditioned official acts on a public announcement by the new Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, of politically motivated investigations, including one into President Trump's domestic political opponent. In pressuring President Zelensky to carry out his demand, President Trump withheld a White House meeting desperately sought by the Ukrainian president and critical U.S. military assistance to fight Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine. Page 9. The president engaged in this course of conduct for the benefit of his own presidential reelection to harm the election prospects of a political rival, and to influence our nation's upcoming presidential election to his advantage. In doing so, the president placed his own personal and political interests above the national interest of the United States, sought to undermine the integrity of the U.S. presidential election process, and endangered U.S. national security. At the center of this investigation is the memorandum prepared following President Trump's July 25th, 2019 phone call with Ukraine's president, which the White House declassified and released under significant public pressure. The call record alone is stark evidence of misconduct, a demonstration of the president's prioritization of his personal political benefit over the national interest. In response to President Zelensky's appreciation for vital U.S. military assistance, which President Trump froze without explanation, President Trump asked for a favor, though. 2 specific investigations designed to assist his re-election efforts. Our investigation determined that this telephone call was neither the start nor the end of President Trump's efforts to bend U.S. foreign policy for his personal gain. Rather, it was a dramatic crescendo within a months-long campaign driven by President Trump, in which senior U.S. officials, including the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Acting Chief of Staff, the Secretary of Energy, and others were either knowledgeable of or active participants in an effort to extract from a foreign nation the personal political benefits sought by the president. The investigation revealed the nature and the extent of the president's misconduct, notwithstanding an unprecedented campaign of obstruction by the president and his administration to prevent the committees from obtaining documentary evidence and testimony. A dozen witnesses followed President Trump's orders, defying voluntary requests and lawful subpoenas and refusing to testify. The White House, Department of State, Department of Defense, Office of Management and Budget, and Department of Energy refused to produce a single document in response to our subpoenas. Ultimately, this sweeping effort to stonewall the House of Representatives' sole power of impeachment under the Constitution failed because witnesses courageously came forward and testified in response to lawful process. The report that follows was only possible because of their sense of duty and devotion to their country and its Constitution. Nevertheless, there remain unanswered questions, and our investigation must continue, even as we transmit our report to the Judiciary Committee. Given the proximate threat of further presidential attempts to solicit foreign interference in our next election, we cannot wait to make a referral until our efforts to obtain additional testimony and documents wind their way through the courts. The evidence of the president's misconduct is overwhelming, and so too is the evidence of his obstruction of justice. Indeed, it would be hard to imagine a stronger or more complete case of obstruction than that demonstrated by the president since this inquiry began. The damage the president has done to our relationship with a key strategic partner will be remedied over time, and Ukraine continues to enjoy strong bipartisan support in Congress. But the damage to our system of checks and balances and to the balance of power within our three branches of government will be long-lasting and potentially irrevocable if the president's ability to stonewall Congress goes unchecked. Any future president will feel empowered to resist an investigation into their own wrongdoing, malfeasance, or corruption, and the result will be a nation at far greater risk of all three. The decision to move forward with an impeachment inquiry is not one we took lightly. Under the best circumstances, impeachment is a wrenching process for the nation. I resisted calls to undertake an impeachment investigation for many months on that basis, notwithstanding the existence of presidential misconduct that I believe to be deeply unethical and damaging to our democracy. The alarming events and actions detailed in this report, however, left us with no choice but to proceed. In making the decision to move forward, we were struck by the fact that the president's misconduct was not an isolated occurrence, nor was it the product of a naive president. Instead, the efforts to involve Ukraine in our 2020 presidential elections were undertaken by a president who himself was elected in 2016 with the benefit of an unprecedented and sweeping campaign of election interference undertaken by Russia in his favor, and which the president welcomed and utilized. Having witnessed the degree to which interference by a foreign power in 2016 harmed our democracy, President Trump cannot credibly claim ignorance to its pernicious effects. Even more pointedly, the president's July call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, in which he solicited an investigation to damage his most feared 2020 opponent, came the day after special counsel Robert Mueller testified to Congress about Russia's efforts to damage his 2016 opponent and his urgent warning of the dangers of further foreign interference in the next election. With this backdrop, the solicitation of new foreign intervention was an act of a president unbound not one chastened by experience. It was the act of a president who viewed himself as unaccountable and determined to use his vast official powers to secure his reelection. This repeated and pervasive threat to our democratic electoral process added urgency to our work. On October 3rd, 2019, even as our committee was engaged in this inquiry, President Trump publicly declared anew that other countries should open investigations into his chief political rival, saying, quote, China should start an investigation into the Bidens, and that President Zelensky, if it were me, I would recommend that they start an investigation into the Bidens. When a reporter asked the president what he hoped Ukraine's president would do following the July 25th call, President Trump, seeking to dispel any doubts as to his continuing intention, responded, well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer, unquote. By doubling down on his misconduct and declaring that his July 25th call with President Zelensky was perfect, President Trump has shown a continued willingness to use the power of his office to seek foreign intervention in our next election. His acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, in the course of admitting that the president had linked security assistance to Ukraine to the announcement of one of his desired investigations, told the American people to, quote, get over it. In these statements and actions, the president became the author of his own impeachment inquiry. I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to repeat that one more time. In these statements and actions, the president became the author of his own impeachment inquiry. The question presented by the set of facts enumerated in this report may be as simple as that posed by the president and his chief of staff's brazenness. Is the remedy of impeachment warranted for a president who would use the power of his office to coerce foreign interference in a U.S. election? Or is that now a mere perk of the office that Americans must simply get over? Those watching the impeachment hearings might have been struck by how little discrepancy there was between the witnesses called by the majority and the minority. Indeed, most of the facts presented in the pages that follow are uncontested. The broad outlines, as well as many of the details of the president's scheme, have been presented by the witnesses with remarkable consistency. There will always be some variation in the testimony of multiple people witnessing the same events, but few of the differences here go to the heart of the matter. And so, it may have been all the more surprising to the public to see very disparate reactions to the testimony by the members of Congress from each party. If there was one ill the founding fathers feared as much as that of an unfit president, it may have been that of excessive factionalism. Although the framers viewed parties as necessary, they also endeavored to structure the new government in such a way as to minimize the violence of faction. As George Washington warned in his farewell address, quote, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it, unquote. Today, we may be witnessing a collision between the power of a remedy meant to curb presidential misconduct and the power of faction determined to defend against the use of that system of governance. The president and his allies are making a comprehensive attack on the very idea of fact and truth. How can a democracy survive without acceptance of a common set of experiences? America remains the beacon of democracy and opportunity for freedom-loving people around the world, from their homes and their jail cells, from their public squares and their refugee camps, from their walking hours until their last breath, individuals fighting human rights abuses, journalists uncovering and exposing corruption, persecuted minorities struggling to survive and preserve their faith, and countless others around the globe just hoping for a better life, look to America. What we do will determine what they see and whether America remains a nation committed to the rule of law. As Benjamin Franklin departed the Constitutional Convention, he was asked, "What have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" He responded simply, "A republic, if you can keep it." Adam B. Schiff, Chairman, House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And then what follows is the executive summary in two sections. Section 1, which covers the president's misconduct, and then the other, section 2, is obstruction. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have to break this up into multiple sections. Maybe I'll do section 1 in a separate video, and then section 2. That was just the preface. So we'll just start there. I would encourage your questions and your comments about this. I have had problems in the past with how this was being handled. I really hope that today, which is tomorrow for me, today for you, since you're watching this, that Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, handles the hearings with as much poise and professionalism and control as Schiff did over the course of the last few weeks. And I say that because when there were hearings, when they had Lewandowski there, for instance, it just turned into a shit show. And I don't think that's what we need. We need someone who is in control in their position as chairman. Because the Republicans are not playing like responsible adults. They are turning this into a circus. But I'm very pleased with how this is written. I'm very pleased with how this is laid out. It goes into detail, great detail over the course of the remaining 260 pages that I don't have printed here, with excerpts of testimony, with call logs, with text messages. This is a big deal. They're handling this correctly. Now, listen. Obviously, we don't know what the outcome will be. If we're looking at the future through the lens of today, it's very likely Donald Trump will not be removed from office. If we're making that judgment based on what's happened today. Public polling and public approval for impeachment and removal of Donald Trump is going to have to shift. It's going to have to grow in order to force senators in the Republican Party to do the right thing here. But the evidence that is laid out in this, and the case that is laid out, is ironclad if there ever was one. Donald Trump has committed high crimes and misdemeanors against the United States, abusing his office, and further defying the separation of powers by obstructing the power, the investigatory and oversight power of the Congress. Again, I would love your comments. You can either write them in the comments of this video. You can also send questions to onemorething@dollemore.com. You can also send a voicemail. Leave a voicemail, 714-576-4054. Listen, I appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to listen, to follow along in this process. It is the patriotic thing to do. Sometimes it gets dry. Sometimes it can be boring. But if you're paying attention, you're doing your civic duty. I would also encourage you to call your congresswomen, your senators, and let them know what you think about this. Other than that, I guess I'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And this has been One More Thing.